Thanks everyone for coming back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had another late Saturday night, in a sense, another weekend announcement from the Prime Minister, getting that alert that she and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield are going to hold a press conference at 9 p.m. is always pretty unsettling, particularly when it's followed within half an hour of a purge-like sound from your phone announcing the latest change to alert levels. So Auckland now back in level 3 for at least a week, the rest of the country at level 2. Some big challenges still ahead for the economy.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the sort of thing that Treasury had in its forecast back in December. It had some scenarios around its central numbers, and one of those was the country going in and out of level 3 for a number of times through the first 6 to 9 months of this year. And, they obviously saw potential impacts on economic growth and employment outcomes as a result of that. I mean, what's your assessment of this latest lockdown? It's only a week at this stage, but what that might do for economic outcomes, particularly around Auckland?
Well, we saw both in the numbers from the most recent 3 days at alert level 3 and certainly from August's alert level 3 period in Auckland, that spending activity does take quite a significant hit, roughly 40% down, maybe a little bit more even in Auckland, 10 to 15% down across the entire country. So there's a real hit that comes through there to the economy. Certainly over the last 48 hours or so, I've heard from a lot of businesses who simply put are exhausted. They're really struggling. Their nerves are sort of shot by these changes to alert levels, these late nights having to try and prepare and shift their operations and put into place the different protocols. For a lot of businesses, they've already bought stock, they've already got commitments in place that are then cancelled, and so all of that costs them money. The broad direction for the economy, I think, still is pretty upbeat, but man, it is a tough position for a lot of businesses to move through. One of the challenges we're also hearing as well is that the administrative burden is relatively high for some of the supports that the government has. So, for example, we want to make sure that when Kiwis are asked to self-isolate, asked to take a COVID test and stay around at home, that they do that. Otherwise, being out in the community, risking that transmission is a pretty easy way to get us back to alert level 3. But the short-term absence payment that the government provides, that has to be requested by your employer after the fact. It takes a while, there's a lot of paperwork, and you wonder why we can't actually streamline some of that activity, have it going through Ministry of Health or Ministry of Social Development, tied to, when someone calls Healthline, they can get that support directly. So, what we've heard a lot, I think, over the last week or so is that we recognise now that we might yo-yo up alert levels for a while, yet we certainly don't want to. But if we are going to, then we need to continually improve our COVID response. We need to look every time at how we can do better next time to try and limit some of these exposures, because they are going to be costing businesses. And that yo-yo effect that we did warn of last year could well put some businesses up against the wall, and you wonder what government might plan next to actually provide some support.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, look, with the first lockdown back in April last year, the government moved very quickly and threw a lot of money out the door to support businesses, and that worked very well. We've seen the economic outcomes from that, but obviously now there's wanting to be a little more cautious with the money, but you don't want to be overloading businesses with that sort of administrative burden and the sort of costs that go along with that. What's your sense, I guess, of how long, in terms of, how long businesses can cope with a lockdown this time around? It's very uneven. I mean, I talk to businesses and, manufacturers, the first lockdown that they went into, and, that was big issues in terms of just getting the processes set up. But now it's relatively easily in some of those sort of industrial areas. But obviously you talk about, businesses which are more reliant on, I guess, perishable stock levels. You think of the sort of hospitality and those sort of businesses where it's not as easy as just ringing up your staff and saying, okay, keep your shifts separate or work from home or whatever. So, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think there is a big tension there, particularly because we now have the wage subsidy back in play for businesses. They've got to prove a 40% drop in revenue, but that 40% drop in revenue is now compared to the last 6 weeks. So what we're seeing is that the wage subsidy is helpful for those who have been hit by the alert level change. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But it also means that some of those businesses who are hard hit anyway, they've got to prove a pretty big drop on top of an already big drop. If you're a hospitality business in the middle of Auckland CBD that hasn't been performing well for a while, you've got to sort of have an even larger drop now to qualify for support. So it does speak to how these supports are important. The government putting some money out is critical, but there are some businesses that are really struggling, and I worry in a sense that we haven't thought about what is next. We can't just provide a wage subsidy to some businesses who are in a tough place and can't operate for a week or two. We've got to find a better way. We've got to resource businesses better to be able to operate, or at least I think consider what those additional funding or support services might be, because essentially what we're saying at Alert Level 3 is, Auckland, put a quarter of your economy on ice just for a little bit. Now, we have gotten better at operating, but that certainly can't be our long-term solution. Now, I'd love to be able to sort of have my crystal ball and my magic wand to come up with a good solution. I think we recognise as a country that there aren't any great solutions at the moment, but I think we've got to be prepared to think about something better, because the current status quo isn't sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, and I think you sort of alluded to it really. I mean, you look back at the three-day lockdown we had a couple of weeks ago, and after that had already started, then the government was rushing legislation through to make sure that the support was going to be available for businesses. It's sort of, it was 4 or 5 months since the previous lockdown, and they still hadn't got those processes in place, which, I mean, it's all very well making things up as you go along when the pandemic, gets underway, but we're almost 12 months down the track now and still seem to be making things up as we go along, which is a little bit disappointing, I would have thought.
Yep, absolutely. And the big challenge at the moment is that New Zealand's health response has been very, very forthright, very proactive. We've got our track and trace systems that are working well, but our business support has always been reactive. It's always been trying to adjust after the fact to the latest change in circumstances. We've got to get ahead of the curve. Otherwise, I do fear that this year, although the economic path looks better, that we could still have a pretty vulnerable economy and some very, very hard up against it businesses who might fold. So, yeah, some real challenges moving through there. Look, I'm glad that everyone's safe, and Gareth, it's good to see that we're maintaining our social distance as well. You at home, me in the office, and I think we'll keep assessing how these lockdowns, how these alert level restrictions are going to change the economy, and we'll update everyone on one of our next editions of Econ Talks.